Following the Second World War, there were a number of military officers and generals who were executed after being found guilty of being involved in war crimes. In the Pacific Theatre, a number of Japanese generals were executed for ordering executions of civilians, causing terror, and also being responsible for large-scale atrocities. Some of the fighting in the Pacific was some of the most intense, brutal, and terrifying of the whole conflict, and the Japanese became a fearsome and incredibly dangerous enemy for the Americans. Often they captured Allied soldiers and forced them into terrible conditions in captivity, and large-scale war crimes such as the Bataan Death March occurred under their jurisdiction. But there was one American-born general officer who became the only American general to be executed by enemy forces in the Second World War. Brigadier Fort fell into the hands of the enemy and defiantly went to his death at the hands of the Japanese. Join us today as we look at the horrific execution of the American general slaughtered during World War II. And remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Guy Osborne Fort was born in 1879 in Michigan. But at the age of 20, after the family had moved to New York, Guy enlisted in the US Army at the turn of the 20th century. He had dropped out of school to do this, and he then went to the Philippines, and whilst here he settled with his first wife, who tragically died in 1927, following giving birth to Guy's second son. When he arrived in the Philippines, he served for 3 years in the 4th US Cavalry Unit, before he was discharged and decided to settle there. 2 years after, he had been commissioned as a 3rd Lieutenant in the Philippine Constabulary, a police force which was under the control of the Americans. He worked as a member of the police force, and he would help to suppress a number of rebellions, and also deal with a number of crimes. Guy Fawkes got stuck into his life inside the Philippines, which was a long departure from his early life in America. He worked also as a plantation manager, and would stay inside the constabulary until the Second World War broke out, and he had risen to the rank of a colonel. He was based in Mindanao, and as an officer, he was known for being a very respectful man, who accepted the customs and beliefs of the local people, and he was also instrumental in convincing rebels to stop fighting and to give up. He became an expert in the people, and was an asset to the Americans. But the Japanese had planned an occupation of the Philippines as part of their plans for a huge Greater East Asia War. They would launch an invasion by sea from Formosa, and the defending forces at the time did outnumber the Japanese forces, but many of them were very ill prepared. Some had hardly any experience, and during the Battle of the Philippines, around 23,000 American military personnel were killed and captured, along with around 100,000 Filipino soldiers. The fall of the Philippines was considered one of the worst military defeats in US military history. In the aftermath of the campaign, it marks the beginning of a 3.5-year period in time where Allied soldiers were treated terribly and the Japanese conducted war crimes such as the Bataan Death March. Japanese prison camps were also regarded as hell on earth, and American and Allied men were sometimes sent to Japan to be used as slave labour in mines and factories. Thousands were held in the holds of crowded Japanese ships without food, water and ventilation, and there was large-scale death everywhere. But in November 1941, the constabulary Guy Fawkes was part of was absorbed into part of the Philippine Army under the control of the United States Army forces in the Far East. Fawkes was then sent to Bohol and was ordered to take command of the 81st Division based there, and on the 20th of December 1941 he was promoted to Brigadier General. He took his division to Lanao Province, and he organised a number of battalions of Moro soldiers that were given weapons and uniforms. He was part of planning the defence in his area. However, he saw that the task of fighting the Japanese would be eventually too much. With this, he knew that there was need for guerrilla warfare, and he also made preparations for his men to take part in this when it was needed. The 81st Division, overseen by Guy Fawkes, started fighting on the 29th of April 1942, and early on it was clear that the Japanese had better equipment, vehicles and also organisation, but the division did not give up. They continued to fight constantly and did inflict heavy losses and casualties onto the Japanese, but they were still being pushed back by the might of the Japanese army. Fort's division was valiant and stood firm longer than any other army groups in the area, and despite knowing they would soon have to surrender, Guy Fawkes made preparations before this. He ordered his soldiers to use demolition charges before they surrendered to close one of the main roads through the island, and to make things difficult for the Japanese, following their waving of the white flag. However, a last-ditch stand came against the Japanese on Mindanao, and Fort was then given orders from his higher command to surrender and to give the fight up. Fort was not a fan of this, and he did not want to surrender, and he protested heavily with his superiors, but there was nothing that could be done. Because of this, he obeyed the orders and surrendered his soldiers on the 27th of May 1942 to the Japanese. The Moro people and his soldiers were incredibly angry, and they did not want to surrender, but Fort would let the native soldiers keep US Army rifles and equipment, which he would then use for guerrilla warfare against the enemy. Following the surrender, Fort was taken captive, and he was shipped north on a small ship with other captured generals, including Fort's commander. One man who was transported with him would even later become the first president of the Philippines. But Guy Fawkes was taken to Manila, and he was held by the Japanese there in tough conditions for a number of months. In November 1942, the Japanese wanted to use him to speak with the Moro people, who had begun to start a large rebellion against the Japanese occupation. Fawkes' skills in speaking with the Moro, it was believed, would help bring the rebels to heed, and Fawkes was supposed to tell them that as the US Army had surrendered, they must also give up arms and surrender too. Guy was taken from Manila to Mindanao, and he was ordered to tell the Moro people to surrender, but then he refused to do this. Because of his refusal, the Japanese then decided Guy Fawkes was a lost cause, and they decided then to execute him. The order to do this had come from Lieutenant Colonel Yoshinari Tanaka, who after the Second World War would also be executed by hanging for executing Guy Fawkes and 3 other American soldiers. Guy Fawkes on the 11th of November 1942, near to where he'd been asked to speak to his former forces, was brought into a clearing where a firing squad had been gathered. He stood there defiant, and he spoke to his firing squad saying, "You may get me, but you will never get the United States of America." Shortly after this, a firing squad shot straight and killed him, executing the only American-born general officer. Fawkes' body was never recovered, and still today his family is seeking to recover his remains so they can be repatriated back and be given a proper burial. But Guy Fawkes was a brigadier general who fought in the Philippine Army under the control of the United States. He was given his own division to command, who fought valiantly against the Japanese, but ultimately he could not work for his enemy and help their war effort, and because of this he was sentenced to death and was forced to face a firing squad. He is remembered as the only American-born general officer to have been executed by enemy forces during the Second World War, and his story is one which definitely deserves to be well known. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.